The record begins not with a presence but with a series of administrative absences. In the archives of the General Register Office, the sequence of the decennial census is mathematically rhythmic: 1821, 1831, 1841. The progression suggests a state in total command of its data. However, as the eye moves across the shelf to the space where the mid-decade supplemental proceedings should reside, the binding changes. The leather-bound precision of the 1841 survey, overseen by Captain Thomas Larcom, gives way to a series of unbound, loose-leaf distress papers. The year is 1847. The state has ceased to count people and has begun, instead, to measure the rate of their disappearance. The 1841 census of Ireland was considered a masterpiece of Victorian bureaucracy. It was a document of 800 pages, categorizing the population by age, sex, occupation, and state of the family. It was the first to utilize the Form A individual household return, moving away from the unreliable estimates of local magistrates. Captain Larcom's methodology was clinical. Every individual was a data point. Every cabin was a structural unit. By the close of 1841, the population was fixed at 8,175,124. This number served as the baseline for the Imperial tax rolls and the poor law valuations. It was a static, observable reality. The files from the winter of 1846 indicate a shift in the clerical language. The census mentality, the desire to name and categorize, was replaced by a relief mentality. The records show a directive issued from the Office of Public Works in Dublin, dated January 14, 1847. The memo instructs local enumerators that the scheduled interim population checks are to be suspended. The justification provided in the ledger is a matter of resource allocation. The machinery of the count is required for the machinery of the soup kitchen. The protocol was thus altered. The state no longer required the names of the living. It required the tonnage of the grain dot in the archives. This period is marked by the non-return. A non-return occurs when a local official, usually a member of the Irish Constabulary, submits a form that is entirely blank except for the name of the townland. In the barony of Moycarn, County Roscommon, the file for March 1847 contains 17 such pages. There is no annotation explaining why the columns for inhabited dwellings and number of persons and family were left empty. There is only the signature of the officer and the date. The procedure for a standard census requires a preliminary enumeration. This involves a physical visit to the dwelling. The records of the Dublin Castle Relief Commission describe the difficulties encountered by the officers tasked with these visits. It is noted in the ledger that in many instances the officers refused to enter the structures. The clinical term used in the reports is contagion risk. Consequently, the data began to be collected from a distance. An officer would stand at the edge of a clearing and observe. If no smoke was seen from the chimney and no movement was detected for a period of 48 hours, the household was marked as presumed vacant. This shift from enumeration to presumption is the moment the 1847 census failed. The records show that presumed vacant did not distinguish between a family that had fled to the ports and a family that remained inside the structure, deceased. The ledger, tasked with the pursuit of accuracy, began to facilitate a mass omission among the papers of the undersecretary. There is a draft of what was intended to be the 1847 supplemental survey. It contains columns that do not exist in the 1841 or 1851 records. These columns are titled Number of persons sustained by gratuity, Number of persons incapable of labor, and Observations on the state of the corpse. This last column is rarely filled. When it is, the handwriting is often hurried, the ink smudged. The entries are repetitive. Unburied, partially consumed, found on the road. In the National Archives, there is a specific box, reference series RLFC3, which contains the reports on the progress of the census. In April 1847, a clerk named William Stanley wrote a private note in the margin of a summary table. He pointed out that the numbers being reported by the Board of Works regarding those employed on the public roads did not align with the numbers being reported by the local relief committees. There was a discrepancy of approximately 150,000 individuals, Stanley's note asks. A procedural question: where are the missing units? The response, if there was one, is not in the file. Instead, the next page in the sequence is a formal order to cease the collection of individual names in the western districts of Mayo and Cork. The order states that aggregate estimations will suffice for the remainder of the season. With this stroke of the pen, the individual, the form A unit was deleted from the state's vision. The people of these districts ceased to be names and became the aggregate. This transition into the aggregate is visible in the physical archives. The papers become thinner. The quality of the stationery declines. The detailed descriptions of occupations, weaver, blacksmith, laborer, disappear, replaced by the monolithic term distressed person. The census page that was never published refers to a specific document mentioned in a letter from the census office to the Treasury in London. The letter, dated August 1847, mentions a summary of the population flux for the first 6 months of the year. This summary was intended to provide the first official look at the demographic collapse. However, the letter concludes with a statement that the summary has been withheld for further verification of the mortality rates. The file remains incomplete here. There is no record of the summary ever being verified. There is no record of it being destroyed. There is only the reference to its existence, a ghost document. That was supposed to bridge the gap between the 8 million of 1841 and the 6.5 million of 1851. The ledger for 1847 contains a final entry for the spring quarter. It is a report from a sub-inspector in Skibbereen. He notes that the previous month's count is now entirely obsolete as the subjects of the survey have moved. When asked where they moved, the inspector's report contains a gap. He does not specify a destination. He simply writes, "They are no longer at the address," before the archive continues. This record was briefly withheld for classification. Viewers who wish to follow future releases may subscribe. The file then resumes in the year 1847, the sub-inspectors. Inability to track the movement of the population led to a new archival category, the unaccounted for. This category would soon become the largest section of the 1847 ledger. In the basement of the Dublin Castle Archives, there is a map used by the commissioners to track this flux. It is marked with red ink to show the paths of migration. But in the center of the map, in the mountainous regions of Connaught, there are areas where the red lines simply stop. There are no arrows pointing toward the ports. There are no marks indicating a return to the townland. There is only a notation in the legend of the map that reads, "Data unavailable." The records show that on the evening of May 12, 1847, the census office received a package from an unknown sender in County Sligo. It was a bundle of local parish records, meticulously kept by a village schoolmaster. It contained the names, ages, and last known locations of 400 individuals who had disappeared from the official rolls, according to the logbook. The package was received, assigned a tracking number, and placed in the pending tray. The next entry in the logbook is dated 3 months later. It does not mention the package. The 400 names from Sligo were never integrated into the master file. Their names were never transcribed onto the official census forms. To the state, those 400 individuals remained unaccounted for. Subscribed. Asterisk in the hierarchy of Victorian governance. The Irish Constabulary served as the eyes of the state when the administrative centres in Dublin required data from the periphery. The task fell to the uniformed officers of the 1,600 local barracks. By 1847, their primary duty had shifted from the prevention of agrarian crime to the quantification of human loss. The ledger for this year contains the weekly returns of the Constabulary, a series of documents that track the transformation of the Irish landscape into a series of silent grids. The records show that the Inspector General issued a standing order in February 1847. All patrols are to include an observation of the occupancy of cabins. The resulting files are known as the Blue Returns. Unlike the official census, which sought to capture the complexity of a household, the Blue Returns were binary. They recorded only 2 states, occupied or extinguished. The procedure was clinical. A constable would approach a dwelling. He was instructed not to dismount his horse if the stench of the fever was present. From the saddle, he would observe the state of the thatch. If the roof had been pulled, a common practice during eviction or to prevent the spread of typhus, the house was recorded as a waste unit. In the barony of Erris, the records for March 1847 show a sequence of entries by a Sergeant McElroy. His ledger is a study in procedural repetition. On March 4th, he records 42 occupied dwellings in the townland of Mulligrew. On March 11th, the number is 38. On March 18th, it is 12. There is no accompanying text to explain the loss of 26 households in 7 days. The ledger simply moves to the next townland. The silence of the record is absolute. A significant gap appears in the constabulary files regarding the destination of the departed. When a family was found to have left their dwelling, the officer was required to note their intended location. In the 1841 census, this was usually the next parish or seasonal labor in England. In the 1847 returns, the column for destination is frequently filled with a single, non-geographic word, unknown. The file remains incomplete here because unknown served as a bureaucratic catch-all. It encompassed those who had died in the fields, those who had reached the workhouse, and those who had crawled into famine holes, shallow, unmarked pits. By labeling them unknown, the constabulary avoided the legal necessity of a coroner's inquest. If a person was not officially dead on their accord but merely unknown in their location, the state was not required to account for the body. The records of the sub-inspector for North Cork contain a specific memorandum regarding the disposal of effects. When a household was marked extinguished, the police were tasked with securing the property. The ledger lists the items found in these abandoned structures. The inventory for one cabin in Skibbereen dated April 1847, reads, 1 iron pot, cracked, 1 wooden stool, 1 pile of rotted straw, 0 foodstuffs. The constable noted that the iron pot was left in situ, as it had no market value. This inventory is the final recorded mention of the family that lived there. They were never entered into the 1847 distress summary, because they did not meet the criteria for active relief. They had ceased to be claimants before the count reached them. In May 1847, a new directive was sent from Dublin Castle to all barracks. It was titled, Regarding the Accuracy of Mortality Returns. The administration was concerned that the numbers being reported by the police were statistically improbable. They argued that the death rates being filed were too high to be supported by the available food supply data. The response from a sergeant in County Clare is preserved in the correspondence series. Hugh wrote, "The numbers are not improbable. They are merely incomplete. I have stopped counting those found by the roadside, as they do not belong to my district. I only count those who die within the walls of a registered dwelling." This procedural choice to only count those who died at home created a massive statistical vacuum. The thousands who died in transit between their homes and the relief works were effectively erased from the 1847 data. They became the unrecorded. The ledger of the Constabulary also contains the cattle and crop returns. It is noted in the files that while the human population in the district of Ballina dropped by 30% in the first half of 1847, the livestock count remained remarkably stable. The police were tasked with protecting the export of grain and cattle. The records show the exact number of oats and barley moved under armed escort. The contrast in the record-keeping is stark. The grain is measured in bushels and pounds and tracked from the field to the port with meticulous accuracy. The people are measured in estimated losses and general declines. The state's ledger was capable of tracking a sack of flour across the Atlantic, but it could not or would not track the child who had lived in the cabin where the flour was grown. There is a final, haunting entry in the June ledger for the Galway district. A constable was sent to verify a nil return, a report that a village was entirely empty. Upon arrival, he found the report to be physically accurate. However, he noted in his log that he heard noises from the earth. He did not investigate further. He marked the file as verified, population 0. The file contains a gap in the year 1847 regarding the noises mentioned by the officer. No follow-up was ordered. The village remained 0 on the official tax valuation. The constabulary returns for the summer of 1847 end abruptly. In July, the Temporary Relief Act expired, and the responsibility for record-keeping shifted to the poor law unions. The police were ordered to turn over their ledgers to Theoric housemasters. Many of these ledgers never arrived. In the transfer of data from the barracks to the workhouses, thousands of pages of blue returns vanished. Historians searching for the 1847 counts in the 20th century found only empty folders. The official explanation in the archive is administrative oversight. The record shows, however, that the oversight was selective. The tax records were preserved. The grain exports were preserved. Only the count of the extinguished households was lost, while the state's records began to fragment into aggregates and non-returns. The private estate ledgers of the landed gentry maintained a different kind of precision. The archives of the Strokestown Park estate in County Roscommon contained what is perhaps the most complete procedural map of human displacement in 1847. This is not a census of citizens, but a ledger of tenancy units to the landlord, Major Dennis Mahon. The population was not a demographic to be protected, but a clog on the productivity of the soil. The file for 1847 centers on document 127, a large format ledger bound in heavy vellum. It is an internal census of the 12,000 tenants living on the estates, 11,000 acres. Unlike the government records, which were paralyzed by the scale of the crisis, the Strokestown ledger is cold, efficient, and final. The records show that in early 1847, Major Mahon commissioned a valuation survey. The purpose of this survey was to identify every individual who was in arrears, those unable to pay their rent due to the failure of the potato crop. The ledger is organized by Townland, Bailey Kilkline, Cashel, and Clunihy. Each name is followed by a numerical value representing their debt. The procedure for clearing the ledger was recorded in the estate's correspondence with its agents, Guinness and Mahon. The records show a calculated decision. It was mathematically cheaper to pay for the passage of the tenants to British North America than to support them through the poor law rates. The ledger began to transform from a rental record into a departure manifest. In the columns of document 127, a specific mark begins to appear next to hundreds of names. It is a small, handwritten X in red ink. According to the internal code of the estate office, this X signified that the tenant had accepted the offer. The offer was a ticket on a chartered ship, provided they signed a deed of surrender, legally vacating their cabin and relinquishing all future claims to the land. The file contains several of these surrender deeds. They are standardized forms. The language is purely procedural. I do hereby surrender my holding and agree to remove myself and my family from the estate. The signatures are almost entirely marked simple crosses made by individuals who could not write their names. The ledger tracks the movement of these X marks with clinical detachment. On the morning of May 19, 1847, a group of 1,490 people identified in the records as the Strokestown emigrants were marched from the estate to the Royal Canal. They were accompanied by the estate bailiff and a detachment of the 13th Light Dragoons. The records show the cost of the bread provided for the journey, £14 1 South 3D. There is a gap in the official ledger between the arrival of the group at the Dublin docks and their boarding of the ships Naomi, Virginius, and Erin's Queen. However, the private business papers of the shipping agents fill this void. The manifests show that the ships were chartered at the lowest possible rate. The space allocated per person was measured in inches. In the manifest of the Virginius, the population is no longer categorized by family but by freight weight. The Strokestown ledger reflects the outcome of this voyage in a single summary page at the end of the 1847 volume. The entry is dated December. It lists the names of those who departed in May, next to many of the names. The clerk has added a secondary notation, died at sea or died at Grosse Isle. The records show that of the 1,490 who left, 700 did not survive the crossing or the subsequent quarantine. In the ledger of the Strokestown estate, these 700 individuals were not recorded as mortalities in the traditional sense. They were marked as cancelled liabilities. Their deaths achieved the administrative goal of the survey. They were no longer on the land, and they were no longer on the tax roll. The file remains incomplete here because of a specific omission in the estate's final report. While the ledger tracks the 1,490 who were sent away, it fails to account for the approximately 3,000 tenants who were evicted without passage. The records show that as the X marks were being processed, a separate process of leveling was occurring. The estate's crowbar brigade was deployed to physically destroy the cabins of those who could not pay and were not selected for emigration. The census of the leveled does not exist in the official Strokestown archive. Instead, there are only the work orders for the bailiffs. One order, dated June 1847, instructs the team to proceed with the clearance of Clunihy and to ensure no walls are left standing to provide shelter. Following the destruction of these dwellings, the residents disappeared from the estate's records. They were no longer tenants, so they no longer required a line in the ledger. They moved into the category of vagrants, which was a matter for the constabulary or the workhouse, not the landlord. The Strokestown ledger concludes its 1847 entry with a statement of improved value. By removing the surplus population either through death, emigration, or eviction, the estate had increased its projected revenue for the following year. The clog had been cleared. The ledger was clean. However, the file contains a final unresolved detail. On November 2, 1847, Major Dennis Mahon was shot and killed while returning to the estate. The records of the subsequent police investigation show that the authorities searched for a list of names among the local population, a census of the vengeful. The investigation file mentions that many of the suspects were men whose names had been marked with a red X in document 127, but who had somehow remained behind. These individuals existed in a state of archival non-existence. They had been officially recorded as departed or removed, yet they were still physically present in the shadows of the estate. The police were never able to reconcile the X marks in the ledger with the physical bodies of the suspects. The records of the Strokestown estate for 1847 end with an unsolved murder and a population that, according to the paperwork, should not have been there. By the summer of 1847. The census of the Irish population had physically shifted its location. The records were no longer being generated in the townlands of Connaught or the offices of Dublin Castle, but on the timber wharves of Grosse Isle, Quebec, and Windmill Point in Montreal. The unpublished page of the census became a transatlantic manifest. Here, the bureaucracy of the British Empire met the medical bureaucracy of the British North American colonies. The primary document for this period is the Grosse Isle Quarantine Station. Log. It is a procedural record of human filtration. The protocol required that every vessel entering the St. Lawrence River stop for inspection. The ledger was designed to track three variables: the healthy, the sick, and the dead. The records show that the geometry of the station was overwhelmed within the first 3 weeks of May. The quarantine hospital was built to accommodate 200 patients. On May 20th, the ledger notes the arrival of 30 ships carrying over 12,000 passengers. The station's chief medical officer, Dr. George Douglas, recorded the breakdown of the counting system. He noted that the inspection had been reduced to a visual scan of the decks from a distance of several yards. In the Grosse Isle files, The names of the individuals are frequently omitted. They are replaced by the name of the ship and a tally of units. For the ship Agnes, the entry reads, arrived with 427, 150. Dead on voyage. The remaining 277 landed in a state of extreme debility. The records of the Grey Nuns of Montreal provide the clinical counterpoint to the official port logs. Nuns were tasked with managing the fever sheds, long wooden structures erected to house the typhus-stricken survivors. Nuns kept their own registers, which they called the Books of the Dying. These books are a procedural attempt to restore the names that the shipping manifests had discarded. The entries in the Grey Nuns ledger are categorized by condition of the patient upon admission. The notes are clinical, focusing on the presence of petechia, the dark spots indicative of typhus. One entry from June 1847 describes a child found in the arms of a deceased woman on the wharf. The child is recorded only as unidentified boy, approx. 4 years, speaks only Gaelic. The file remains incomplete here, as the boy was never assigned a name in the colony's permanent record. He appears in the Grey Nuns book for 3 days. Then the line is closed with the notation, died 3 a.m., buried in the common pit. The geometry of the fever sheds was a matter of cubic feet per person. The records show that as the arrivals increased, the space allocated to each individual decreased until it reached a state of saturation. In the Windmill Point sheds in Montreal, the ledger of the Board of Health indicates that patients were placed 2 to a bunk. Regardless of their state of consciousness, the most haunting procedural gap in the 1847 transatlantic record involves the manifest discrepancy. When a ship departed Ireland, the captain filed a manifest with the customs house. When the ship arrived in Canada, a new manifest was generated. A comparison of these two documents for the year 1847 reveals a statistical void of several thousand people. The records show that these individuals appear on the departure lists but are absent from both the healthy and dead lists at Grosse Isle. They are not recorded as having been buried at sea. They simply cease to exist between the 2 points of the voyage. In the terminology of the 1847 archive, they are the unaccounted flux. In the National Archives of Canada, there is a series of letters from the Colonial Land and Emigration Commissioners. They were tasked with reconciling these numbers. One letter, dated October 1847, suggests that many of the missing were clandestine passengers, individuals, who had hidden in the holds of the ships and died there, their bodies disposed of by the crew, without a formal entry in the logbook to avoid fines. The census of 1847 was thus being cleaned by the ocean. The names that had been marked with a red X in the Strokestown ledger were being physically removed from the world, and the paperwork was simply catching up to the reality of the void. The fever sheds also generated a new type of record, the orphan list. By August 1847, the Montreal records show 1,200 children whose parents were recorded as deceased or missing during transit. The procedure for these orphans was a re-indexing. They were given new names, often those of the French-Canadian families who adopted them. The file remains incomplete here because the link between the original Irish name, the name that would have appeared on the 1847 unpublished census, and the new Canadian name was rarely preserved. The ledger of the St. Patrick's Orphanage in Montreal contains a column for original identity. but in 60% of the entries for 1847, it is marked unknown survivor of the fever sheds. The records of the unpublished page end at the water's edge. The survivors who left the sheds and moved into the interior of North America were never tracked by a follow-up survey. They became a demographic shadow, a population that existed in physical reality but had been administratively erased from their homeland and had not yet been fully integrated into the records of the New World. The 1847 archive concludes this section with a report from the Montreal Board of Health. It notes that the fever sheds were ordered to be burned to the ground in late 1847 to prevent the further spread of disease. With the burning of the sheds, the physical evidence of the names written on the walls by the dying was destroyed, while the population was being physically processed through the fever sheds of the Atlantic. The administrative heart of the Irish executive Dublin Castle was engaged in a different form of quantification. The distress papers, reference series RLFC, represent this state's attempt to manage the demographic collapse through correspondence. These are not census returns in the traditional sense. They are a collection of thousands of letters, petitions, and reports that form a narrative of structural failure. The records show that by the autumn of 1847, the official census apparatus had been entirely superseded by the Relief Commission. The ledger of the commission reflects a transition in terminology. Individuals were no longer identified by name or trade, but by their category of destitution. The procedure for the distress papers was strictly hierarchical. A local relief committee, often headed by a clergyman or a magistrate, would submit a statement of local conditions to Dublin Castle. These statements were then indexed by clerks and assigned a degree of urgency from 1 to 5. In the file for the barony of Kilmacrenan, County Donegal, the records show a series of letters from a Reverend Hastings. In May 1847, he submitted a list of 200 families who were beyond the reach of the current ration. The response from Dublin Castle, noted in the margin of the letter, is purely procedural. The Reverend is reminded that the limit for the district has been reached. No new names can be added to the list until a vacancy occurs through death or removal. This created a waiting list for the census. Individuals who were physically present and starving were not administratively alive. For the purposes of the Relief Commission, until someone else was recorded as ceased, the file remains incomplete. Here, because the waiting lists themselves were often discarded once the vacancy was filled, the names of those who died while waiting to be added to the official list of the distressed were never captured in the 1847 data. They exist only in the aggregate. The statistical difference between the number of rations issued and the estimated population of the parish. The distress papers also contain the index to outrages. This was a record-keeping effort to track the breakdown of social order. It is noted in the ledger that distress was often measured by the frequency of unlawful gatherings or the theft of turnips in the West Riding of Cork. The records for June 1847 show a sharp decline in reported outrages. A modern observer might interpret this as an improvement in conditions. However, the internal memo from the Chief Secretary's office offers a clinical correction. The decrease in reported crime is not indicative of order, but of the physical inability of the population to engage in protest. The subjects are too weak to assemble. The 1847 census was thus a survey of exhaustion. One of the most significant procedural gaps in the Dublin Castle Archive is the omission of the townlands. In the preparation of the 1847 summary reports, certain geographic areas were excluded from the final tables. The records show that if a townland's mortality rate exceeded a specific threshold, approximately 25% within a single quarter, it was often marked as unreliable data and omitted from the aggregate. The justification found in the clerk's manual for the census office states, "Extremes of mortality render the statistical baseline unstable and are therefore unsuitable for the general return. By removing the extremes, the state effectively sanitized the 1847 record." The unpublished page of the census was not a single sheet of paper, but the sum total of these excluded townlands. In the National Archives, these excluded files are kept in a separate series known as the Supplemental Returns. They were never bound into the official blue books presented to Parliament. The records also show the influence of the Vagrancy Act on the 1847 count. To be counted in the census, an individual was theoretically required to have a fixed place of abode. But by the late summer of 1847, a significant portion of the population was in motion. The distress papers describe masses of shadows moving along the roads toward the cities of Dublin, Belfast, and Cork. The procedure for these individuals was summary removal. If they were found without a pass from their local poor law union, they were not recorded as residents of the city. They were recorded as incidents of vagrancy. In the Dublin City records for 1847, there are 15,000 such incidents. The names were rarely taken. They were simply counted as they were turned back at the city limits or escorted to the Bureaucratic, the distress papers conclude with the transition to the new poor law in the winter of 1847. This was the moment the British government declared the famine over as a national emergency, transferring the entire cost of relief to the local Irish taxpayers. The records show a final clinical instruction from the Treasury in London to the Relief Commission in Dublin. The special files for the year 1847 are to be closed. Future counts will be handled by the boards of guardians. The individual names are no longer required for the central audit. The file contains a gap here regarding the disposal of the local lists. Many local committees, unable to afford the cost of postage or stationery, stopped maintaining their detailed registers of the hungry. The names of the waitlisted and the omitted were simply allowed to fade as the ink was reclaimed for other, more pressing tax documents. The 1847 census remains unpublished because it was never completed. It was a series of local observations that were never allowed to become a national record. The state had seen enough of the data to know that a complete count would be administratively inconvenient. The failure to publish the 1847 census was not merely a result of logistical collapse. The records in the Treasury and the Colonial Office reveal that it was an act of statistical selection. To the administrators in London, most notably Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, the population of Ireland was no longer a collection off subjects, but a surplus to be corrected by the laws of nature and economy. The 1847 ledger was where the human unit met the Malthusian limit. The records show that the 1841 census had already been scrutinized through the lens of Reverend Thomas Malthus's principle of population. The theory posited that population growth would inevitably outstrip food production unless checked by misery and vice. In the 1847 files, this theory is no longer a philosophical abstract. It is a procedural guideline. The procedure for the 1847 aggregate returns was overseen by the Statistical Department of the Board of Trade. The records show a series of calculations performed in the spring of 1847 to determine the effective carrying capacity of the Irish land. The clerks did not calculate how much food was needed to keep 8 million people alive. Instead, they calculated how many people the reformed Irish economy, one based on large-scale grazing rather than small-scale tillage, could sustain. The number arrived at in the memo was approximately 5 million. The file remains incomplete here because the memo does not specify what was to happen to the surplus 3 million. However, the subsequent record-keeping provides the answer. In the 1847 distress papers, the term redundant population begins to appear with increasing frequency. It is noted in the ledger of the Chief Secretary's office that relief should not be so generous as to encourage the survival of the redundant. The Malthusian arithmetic also dictated the closure of the census. If the state were to officially count the dying, it would be forced to acknowledge the failure of its market-based relief policy. By refusing to finalize the 1847 census, the administration maintained a state of deliberate ignorance. If the numbers did not exist in the ledger, the surplus was being removed by an invisible hand, rather than by a specific policy of the Crown. In the archives of the Royal Statistical Society, there is a paper from 1847 titled On the Correction of the Irish Demographic. The author, a junior clerk in the census office, argued that the 1841 numbers were grossly inflated by the inclusion of the landless classes. He proposed a procedural correction for 1,847. Any person who did not hold at least a half-acre of land should be excluded from the permanent population estimate. The records show that this correction was partially adopted. In the internal summaries of 1847, the landless laborer disappears as a category. They are merged into the vagrant class, a group that was not counted in the local population totals. By mathematically reclassifying a person as a vagrant, the state effectively removed them from the townlands census without having to record their death. The unpublished page of the census thus became a site of administrative erasure. The 1847 archive contains a specific folder labeled the Gregory Clause Correspondence, named after William Gregory, an Irish MP. The clause stated that no tenant holding more than a quarter acre of land could receive government relief. To get the ration, the tenant had to surrender their land. The records of the poor law unions show the procedural result of this clause. Thousands of families are recorded as surrendered. Once the land was surrendered, the family lost its address. In the 19th century census model, an individual without an address could not be enumerated. They became the floating population. The file remains incomplete here because there was no mechanism to track the floating population. The 1847 ledger shows that once a name was removed from the tenancy roll, it vanished from the state's tracking system entirely. They were no longer units of productivity. They were units of consumption, and as such, they were only tracked by the weight of the meal they were issued. By the winter of 1847, the Malthusian arithmetic had achieved a grim equilibrium. The records of the Dublin port show the arrival of several scientific observers sent from London to study the physiology of thephamine. Their reports are kept in the medical series of the Home Office. One observer noted that the reduction in numbers was proceeding with remarkable statistical regularity. He compared the decline of the Irish population to the thinning of a forest to allow for the growth of more robust timber. The 1847 census was never published because the results were already known to the mathematicians of the Treasury. The goal was not to save the 8 million of 1841, but to reach the 5 million of the improved future. The unpublished page was the record. Of the 3 million who did not fit the calculation, the ledger for 1847 contains a final, chilling note from the Treasury. It is a response to a request for more funds to complete the provincial counts. The note reads, "The demographic correction is currently self-administering. Further expenditure on enumeration is deemed redundant." To understand the 1847 census page that was never published, one must examine the micro-record, the point where the individual name collided with the state's refusal to hear it. The archive contains a singular, anomalous file from the parish of Aughrim. It is not an official government return, but a parallel ledger kept by Father John O'Sullivan. It serves as a clinical rebuttal to the official nil return filed by the local constabulary. The records show that in June 1847, the official government enumerator for the district, a man named Henderson, submitted a one-page report to Dublin. It stated that the townlands of Derrylahan and Gordaful were administratively void. The ledger and triareads, no occupants remaining to be counted. Valuation, 0. Father O'Sullivan's parallel ledger, however, provides a different set of data for the same period. The priest did not use the government's Form A. He used a standard Latin baptismal and funeral register, but the entries for 1847 break the established protocol. The columns for sponsors and parents are often left blank. In their place, O'Sullivan recorded the point of discovery. The procedure of the silenced parish was as follows. Every morning at 6 a.m., the priest and 2 remaining sacristans performed a circuit of the ditches. The records show that they did not look for thaliving, but for those who had died during the night while attempting to reach the consecrated ground of the churchyard. In O'Sullivan's ledger, the names are recorded with a precision that the state had abandoned. July 12th, Mary Brennan, age unknown, found at the West Gate. July 12th, an unidentified man, wearing a frieze coat, was found in the hayloft of the O'Malley cabin. July 13th, 3 children of the Walsh family, found together in Thedrywall. The file remains incomplete here, because O'Sullivan's ink ran out in August 1847. The subsequent entries are made with a sharpened piece of charcoal. The writing Bekomeslarger and more erratic, and eventually ceases to follow the ruled lines of the book. The records show that O'Sullivan sent a copy of this death census to the Poor Law Commissioners, demanding that these names be included in the 1847 mortality summary. The response from the commission is preserved in the rejected correspondence file. The clerk noted, "The information provided is ecclesiastical in nature and does not meet the evidentiary standards for a civil return. The individuals mentioned were not inmates of Thurrock House, and therefore cannot be officially recognized as deceased under the Act. The unpublished page was thus protected by a wall of procedural definitions. By the state's logic, if you did not die inside a government-sanctioned institution, your death was a private event and not a statistical fact. The Ogram file contains a map hand-drawn by O'Sullivan. It is a census of the empty. He marked every cabin where the family had died in situ. The map shows 48 structures in a single square mile. On the official 1847 map used by the Relief Commission, this same square mile is shaded in light green, indicating sufficient grazing land with no population notes. The discrepancy is not an error. It is a functional deletion. The records of the silenced parish also highlight the phenomenon of name migration. O'Sullivan noted that as people died, the survivors often took the names of the deceased to qualify for multiple rations or to assume a defunct tenancy. This created a state of demographic entanglement that the 1847 census clerks found impossible to unravel. A memo from the census office in October 1847 admits the identity of the survivors in the western districts is now entirely speculative. The names on the relief rolls do not correspond to the physical persons present. The census is, for all practical purposes, a record of ghosts using the names of the living or vice versa. The unpublished page was eventually suppressed because it revealed this entanglement. To publish the 1847 data would have been to admit that the state had lost the ability to identify its own subjects. The individual unit had been fractured by the necessity of survival. In the final pages of the Ogram ledger, O'Sullivan records the silence of the bells. He notes that he has stopped ringing the funeral bell because the sound disturbs the remaining few who are waiting for their own conclusion. The last entry in the charcoal script is dated November 19, 1847. It is not a name. It is a number, 22 today. No coffins. The file contains a gap in the year 1847 regarding the fate of Father O'Sullivan. The parish records for 1848 are written in a new, clean hand. There is no mention of the charcoal ledger or the map of the empty cabins. The new priest, appointed by the diocese, resumed the standard recording of tithes and marriages as if the 1847 gap were a mere lapse in clerical discipline. The silenced parish remains a fragment. It is a record of a population that was counted by the church but deleted by the state. The 48 cabins marked on O'Sullivan's map were leveled in the spring of 1848. The stones were used to build a wall around a new sheep pasture. The ledger shows that the wall follows the exact perimeter of the former village, the procedural legacy of the unpublished 1847 census did not conclude with the end of the famine. It re-emerged 62 years later as a crisis of evidence. In 1908, the British Parliament passed the Old Age Pensions Act, granting a weekly allowance to British and Irish subjects over the age of 70. To qualify, an applicant born in or before 1838 had to provide proof of age. Since civil registration of births did not begin in Ireland until 1864, the state was forced to return to the only clinical records in existence, the census ledgers of 1841 and 1851. The records show that for those born in the years immediately preceding 1847, the census search was the only path to the pension. The file for the Pension Claims Office in Dublin contains thousands of search forms, Form TS1. A clerk would be sent to the Public Record Office to locate the applicant's family on the original 1841 or 1851 census pages. The procedure was rigid. If the applicant's name could not be found in the 1841 or 1851 returns, the pension was denied. It was during this period that the void of 1847 became a physical reality for the survivors. The archives show that in 1909, a high volume of applicants from the western counties requested searches for the 1847 supplemental returns. They remembered the enumerators. They remembered the blue returns being filled out in the barracks. The records show the standardized response from the deputy keeper of the records. The 1847 returns are not available for consultation. They were never integrated into the public archive. The file remains incomplete here because the records do not state where the 1847 papers were stored, only where they were not. This created a generation of the gap, an individual who was 9 years old in 1847 would have appeared in the 1841 census as a child of 3. However, if their family had been evicted, moved to a different county, or split up during the 1847 flux, they often could not be traced to the same townland in the 1851 census. Without the 1847 record to bridge the displacement, the continuity of their life was broken. In the Pension Appeals series, there is a case file for one Michael Higgins of County Mayo in 1910. He argued that he was 73 years old. The clerk found no record of him in the 1841 census at the address he provided. Higgins claimed that his family had been moved from their original holding in 1847 during the Strokestown clearances, and that a record of this move existed. The ledger of the Appeals Board contains the final ruling. The applicant claims a record exists for 1847. No. Such record is recognized by the state in the absence of 1841 or 1851 data. The applicant is administratively non-existent. Claim rejected. The unpublished page thus became a tool for the denial of the pension. By failing to preserve the 1847 data, the state saved millions of pounds in pension payments to the very people who had survived the demographic collapse. The records also reveal a more disturbing procedural detail. In the 1920s, during an audit of the Public Record Office, it was noted that several volumes of the 1841 and 1851 censuses, specifically those covering the high mortality districts, showed signs of physical tampering. The reports describe excised pages and sections where the binding had been deliberately weakened. The file contains a note from a researcher in 1921 who was looking for the 1847 distress totals for the parish of Skibbereen. He found that the 1851 census for that district began with a corrected baseline that did not account for the 1847 losses. When he asked to see the 1847 worksheets to verify the numbers, he was told that they had been pulping material. Since the 1860s, the pulping order is a matter of record. In 1867, the Stationery Office issued a directive to clear redundant and non-statutory paperwork from the Dublin Castle cellars. The list of items to be destroyed included the preliminary returns of the 1847 local counts. The procedure of pulping ensured that the 1847 census could never be reconstructed. It transformed the names of the unaccounted flux into blank stationary for the next generation of bureaucrats. There is a gap in the year 1847 regarding the pension. Search for the orphans of the fever sheds. In the 1900s, many adults in Canada and the United States wrote to Dublin seeking their original names so they might claim inheritance or simply verify their age. The ledger of the General Register Office shows a 100% failure rate for these searches. Because the 1847 transatlantic manifests were never cross-referenced with the domestic blue returns, the link was severed. One letter from an applicant in Montreal, dated March 1912, asks, "Is there no page for 1847? My father said the police took our names before we boarded the boat." The reply, filed in the Foreign Correspondence Ledger, is a single sentence. The year 1847 was a period of administrative suspension. No names were retained for the permanent record. The 1847 census remains unpublished because it was transformed from a record of the population into a record of the state's refusal to pay. The unpublished page was not just a missing document. It was a missing decade in the lives of the survivors. The file remains incomplete here. In June 1922, the four courts in Dublin was occupied and subsequently destroyed by fire during the Irish Civil War, the vast majority of the 1821, 1831, 1841, and 1851 census returns were incinerated. The fire achieved what the pulping order had started, the total erasure of the 19th century Irish demographic record. However, the 1847 distress papers, the loose-leaf letters and local reports stored in the Dublin castle cellars were not in the four courts. They survived the fire. They remain the only clinical evidence of the unpublished year. Yet they are still categorized as supplemental rather than official. The archive concludes this chapter with a modern notation from the National Archives. It observes that while the 1841 census is a document of presence, the 1847 archive is a document of absence. The clinical resolution of the 1847 census requires an examination of why the document in its final form was never allowed to enter the public record. In the archives of the Census Office, there is a technical report dated 1852. It is the post-mortem of the 1851 census, but it contains a retrospective analysis of why the 1847 supplemental count was abandoned. The report identifies the failure as one of mathematical inconsistency. The records show that the 1847 data, when aggregated from the local relief committees and the constabulary returns, produced a mortality rate that did not align with the state's agricultural exports for the same year. According to the ledger of the Board of Trade, Ireland was still exporting enough grain to sustain a population of several million. However, the 1847 counts showed a population collapse that suggested a total absence of food. The procedure for resolving this inconsistency was simple. The 1847 data was declared anomalous. In the terminology of Victorian statistics, an anomaly is a data point that is so extreme it threatens the validity of the entire model. To include the 1847 unpublished page would have been to admit that the market-driven economy of the British Empire was capable of producing a total demographic vacuum in the midst of a surplus of grain. The file remains incomplete here because the internal correction sheets, the documents where the clerks attempted to adjust the 1847 numbers to make them more palatable for Parliament were not included in the final report. Instead, the 1851 census report simply skips from 1841 to 1851, treating the intervening decade as a single, undifferentiated period of decline. The anatomy of a non-record is also visible in the physical state of the 1847 distress papers. Unlike the 1841 census, which was transcribed by professional clerks into uniform ledgers, the 1847 records are a polyglot archive. They consist of scraps of paper, backs of envelopes, and pages torn from account books. The records show that the state viewed this lack of uniformity as a justification for suppression. A memo from the Home Office in 1848 states, "The returns from the Irish districts are too irregular in their format to be bound for the library. They lack the necessary clerical rigor for a national survey." By defining the record as irregular, the state justified its exclusion from history. In the National Library of Ireland, there is a collection of microfilms of the few surviving local 1847 counts. When viewed under high magnification, the anatomy of the failure becomes clear. You can see where the enumerator's hand began to shake. You can see where the ink was diluted with water to make it last. In the return for the parish of Clifton, the names are written in a script that grows progressively larger until only one or two names fit on a page, the clinical notation. For this is administrative fatigue. The person tasked with the count had ceased to be a clerk and had become a witness. The state, however, has no category for witness. It only has a category for enumerator. The 1847 census was never published because it was a broken record. It did not provide the clean data required for the 1851 transition to a new economic model. It revealed a level of social disintegration that the bureaucracy could not categorize. The unpublished page was a mirror that the administration chose to turn to the wall. The file contains a final, unresolved detail regarding the summary table for 1847. This table was reportedly seen by the Chief Secretary in December 1847. It contained a single number, the estimated total of the unrecorded dead. That number has never been found in any official ledger. The 1847 census exists only as a series of footnotes in later reports, a statistical ghost that haunts the margins of the 1851 count. The final resolution of the 1847 archive is not found in a grand summary, but in the physical cessation of the record-keeping process. By December 31, 1847, the census of the void had reached its administrative limit. The records show that the Relief Commission was formally dissolved and its duties absorbed by the Poor Law Guardians. This was more than a change in department. It was a procedural closure of the investigation into the missing page. The ledger for the final week of December 1847 contains a directive from the Treasury. It instructed all remaining local committees to balance their books and transmit all nominal lists to Dublin. Nominal lists referred to the names of the individuals who had received aid. However, the records show that upon arrival in Dublin, these lists were not archived for demographic study. They were placed in temporary storage in the damp cellars of the Custom House. The procedure for the end of the ledger was a policy of aggregate finality. This state decided that the 1851 census would be the new point. 0. Any person not present for the 1851 count would be treated as if they had never existed in the interim. The 1847 unpublished page was effectively bypassed to ensure the 1851 report would appear. Mathematically consistent, the file remains incomplete. Here, because the 1851 census report contains a specific note on mortality, it admits that the mortality of the previous decade was extensive, but it claims that no reliable data exists for the year 1847 specifically. This claim was a clinical falsehood. The distress papers, the constabulary returns, and the grossile logs provided the data. This state simply chose to define it as unreliable to avoid the necessity of publishing it in the National Archives. The 1847 archive concludes with a series of nil returns from the inspectors tasked with collecting the final ledgers. One inspector in North Mayo reported that he could not retrieve the books from the local committee because the committee has ceased to exist and the books have been lost in the confusion of the winter. This confusion became the official archival explanation. For the gap, the unpublished page exists today only as a collection of shadows. It is found in the gaps between the 1841 and 1851 household returns. It is found in the 700 missing names of the Strokestown Manifest. It is found in the charcoal written deaths of Father O'Sullivan S. Parish. But as a unified state-sanctioned document, it has been successfully deleted. The final entry in the 1847 General Register Office Log is a request for a new set of ledgers. For the year 1848, the clerk noted that the old ledgers were too cluttered with the anomalies of the previous season to be of further use. The 1847 ledger was closed, locked, and moved to the non-consultation wing of the archive. The record of the 1847 census concludes with a physical description of the page that was never published. In the 1950s, a researcher found a single hand-tabulated sheet of paper stuck to the back of an 1851 summary volume. It contained a list of 14,000 deaths from a single district in Skibbereen for the first quarter of 1847. Across the top of the page, an unknown hand had written in red ink, "Do not include." Not for the public eye? The file contains a gap in the year 1847 regarding the identity of the person who wrote that instruction. The census of 1847 remains the only time in the history of the British Isles that the state intentionally stopped counting its people during a period of mass mortality. The ledger's end was not a completion of the task, but a surrender to the void. The 1847 census page was never published, because it was a record of a catastrophe that the state's arithmetic could not justify and its conscience could not name. The file is now closed.